Welcome to History 112, Lecture 14, The Progressive Presidents. The progressive presidents begin with Teddy Roosevelt, and he was a different kind of president. He, first of all, was the youngest president we have had, and he became president as a result of an assassination. Now, when he enters into the White House, he has a reputation based more on style than substance. He brought a lot of energy to politics, though not always results, and he had a reputation as being a wild man or a cowboy based on his days as a bounty hunter in the Dakota Badlands and from things like raising the Rough Riders to fight in Cuba. And he was a war hero from the Spanish-American War, so that kind of all plays into this idea of who Teddy Roosevelt is supposed to be. Now, Teddy Roosevelt is going to take on some very important actions when it comes to trusts, and he is looking at regulation, not destruction. Now, the first person he's going to go after is J.P. Morgan, and it's highly symbolic about the role of government when it comes to business, and that actually confused Morgan. Morgan sent a message to Teddy Roosevelt, said, "If we have done anything wrong, send your man to my man and they can fix it up." This was not the relationship with business that they were accustomed to having, but Teddy Roosevelt is going to make it clear that he is going to very much limit the power of big business during his presidency, and he is going to file 40 antitrust suits. He's not going to try to end consolidation, he's just going to go after what he calls bad trusts and those who are abusing their power in his eyes. And Teddy Roosevelt brings more new things to the table than just going after trusts. He is going to intervene in labor disputes as no other president had before. He is going to side with neither, and he is going to force the federal government to be an arbitrator. A good example is the United Mine Workers strike in 1902. Now, this threatened to cause a coal shortage during the winter because without coal there would not be heat for many homes. Now, the strike would then threaten the entire economy and also the public health. When mine owners refused to be reasonable, Teddy Roosevelt threatened to use federal troops to seize the mines and get things going again. Now, the miners, as a result of Teddy Roosevelt's threat of using force against the owners, which no previous president ever done, meant the miners got more than they would have gotten without federal intervention. They also got less than they wanted because, according to Teddy Roosevelt, he wasn't there to back either side. He was there to force a fair deal that was in everyone's interests. Now, Teddy Roosevelt was not going to just use federal troops against employers. He was also going to use it against labor when he felt they were being unreasonable. So he would threaten both sides, and whichever side he thought was being the unreasonable, stubborn one at the table, they're the ones that he would browbeat. And so he's going to play as a champion of fairness, and this is something very new for a U.S. president. Now, during a lot of Roosevelt's first term, he's in a position where he's simply trying to consolidate for re-election. And again, he had assumed the office following the death of the previous president. He wasn't elected president. He wasn't necessarily the natural successor, so he had to build that up. Now, he is going to use the old patronage system to buy the loyalty of the old guard, but increasingly and importantly, he's going to install a number of progressives in key positions. And he is going to use his handling and the reputation he gets out of those coal strikes to make himself a champion of what he calls the square deal. Now, once he has won re-election, he's going to take on the railroads, and he is going to win quite a bit more than the conservatives wanted, but less than the progressives wanted. And again, Teddy Roosevelt isn't about backing a side, he's about what he thinks is fair. Now, he is going to importantly bring in regulation of food and pharmaceutical industries with the Pure Food and Drug Act, which creates the FDA and the USDA. Now, Teddy Roosevelt is going to increasingly alienate the conservative wing of the Republican Party during his second term by regulating business. And he's also going to do this by using executive power to block the development of some federal lands. Now, when Congress tries to limit his power, he is just going to simply seize vast tracts of land to prevent them from being used for dams or to cut down timber. He's going to take land away from Congress. He's going to create national forests, national parks out of it. And he is going to sometimes, though, have to trade development projects in the West for some of this. And what he's going to do is he's going to select some lands to be preserved on ecological grounds and select others for development. And this is a new idea. And when it does it creates public debate for the first time about which projects are being blocked and which went forward. Because people are going to start talking about environmental issues, about why we should preserve some resources and exploit others. Roosevelt's presidency does take something of a turn with the panic in 1907, and at this point the New York banks failed. Now, J.P. Morgan puts together a restructuring plan, and it would involve lots of shares traded and corporate consolidation to allow the banks to stay in business. It was a giant bailout, and being the most powerful banker, he could not just leverage his financial resources, he could convince a lot of people to join in. But J.P. Morgan will not pull the trigger on this unless he has an agreement that Teddy Roosevelt will not pursue antitrust suits that could arise out of his plan. He says he'll do it, but having had his experience earlier with Teddy Roosevelt and him going after the banks, J.P. Morgan says he wants immunity from anything he needs to do to restart the economy. Now, Teddy Roosevelt gives the go-ahead, and J.P. Morgan gets all the credit for propping up the economy and bailing it out. And Teddy Roosevelt gets all the blame. A lot of the old guard Republicans oppose his radical agenda, as they called it, and what we see is Teddy Roosevelt starts to fall out of favor with his own party to the point that he's unlikely to win the Republican nomination. And so Teddy Roosevelt retires at the end of the term at age 50. He retires at an age before most presidents even run for office. Now, the Republican nomination goes to William Howard Taft, who had been Teddy Roosevelt's picked successor. And the progressives all thought he would continue the reform agenda. But conservatives, on the other hand, looked at his record as a judge, and he had seen how Taft had put heavy emphasis on legal procedure and on what was allowed and what was constitutional. So they thought this would mean that Taft would respect more of what the Constitution said and abandon what conservatives saw as Teddy Roosevelt's heavy use of executive power. So, this means that Taft has the support of both wings of the party and goes almost unopposed to the Republican nomination, and he is going to run against Williams Jennings Bryan on his in 1908, and Democrats have very little support in the election, and Taft wins an easy victory. Now, when it comes to progressivism, Taft was extremely passive. At the beginning of his term, he asked Congress to lower protectionist tariffs, would have been a progressive demand. He is, though, not going to use his influence to help overcome opposition. In Taft's mind, and he comes from a background as a constitutional lawyer, he thinks this is going to violate the separation of powers in the Constitution, and the result is you get a weak compromise. Taft was also fairly reform neutral. He sometimes did not act, and other times he supported certain key issues like children's issues. But by and large, he really doesn't put a lot of emphasis on reforming. But what he does that's very important is he starts replacing a lot of Teddy Roosevelt's people that he had appointed with more conservative people. So he starts taking progressives out of key government jobs and replacing them with more traditionalists. And those people are going to undermine a lot of Teddy Roosevelt's conservation initiatives, and they're also going to help move towards restarting big business, and Taft really doesn't do anything to stop that. And progressives start to denounce Taft for being really passive on these issues. Now, as more progressives turn against Taft, Teddy Roosevelt steps back in the picture. Now, for about 2 years, he had been on a hunting trip in Africa and touring Europe, so he'd kind of not just been out of American politics, but he had been out of the United States itself for about 2 years. And when he returns in 1910, it's a big public event, and a lot of people asked if he was planning to re-enter politics. Now, Teddy Roosevelt says that he is not, but he goes on a national speaking tour and talks about what he calls new nationalism that regulates trust and national interests, and increasingly during the speaking tour he's denouncing Taft, and increasingly he talks about the need of the federal government to champion social justice. Now, all through this, Teddy Roosevelt is going to maintain his goal is not to run again, but to get Taft back on the right path by pointing out what he really needs to do. But two things are going to change his mind. First, Taft is going to openly criticize what Teddy Roosevelt had done in 1907 with his deal with J.P. Morgan and call it illegal, and that criticism is going to deeply wound Teddy Roosevelt. In addition, the main progressive challenger to Taft is going to drop out of the race following a mental breakdown, so Teddy Roosevelt steps back into the arena. Now, he's going to do very well in the Republican primaries, but there's going to be no clear nomination out of them, and the old guard conservatives are going to control the nominating process in the convention and pick Taft. Now, Teddy Roosevelt, having done very strongly, is going to walk out of the convention with his supporters to a big cheering crowd, and it's going to make quite a show of this. Now, Teddy Roosevelt and his supporters are going to meet in Chicago and form a new party. But on his way in, there was an assassination attempt, and Teddy Roosevelt was shot in the chest. Now, he gives this speech where he begins talking about how he had just been shot and how the bullet pierced his speech, and the thickness of the speech was probably the only thing that saved him. And he says he's only going to speak briefly, and then continues for 90 minutes. Now, the official name of Teddy Roosevelt's new party is the Progressive Party, but from that speech he gave, where he said it's harder than that to kill a bull moose, they become known as the Bull Moose Party. Now, the party ultimately is going to fail because a lot of Republicans don't follow him. They are afraid of splitting the Republican Party in face of a strong Democratic challenger. So Teddy Roosevelt ultimately is not going to attract the level of support he had originally hoped. Now, Wilson is going to come into this. Now, there is no clear winner in the Democratic Party for 1912 either. The nomination of more conservative candidates at the convention is being blocked by a new generation of progressive Democrats. On the 43rd vote, they finally come up with a candidate, the antitrust governor of New Jersey, Woodrow Wilson. And he was also had been a political science professor beforehand coming into politics, so he's a well-educated, well-connected man. And Wilson begins to campaign for what he calls a new freedom. And under the new freedom, big is bad. Wilson is going to break trust, whether they are good or bad. He's not going to make that distinction. And so now we are entering into a three-way race. What we have in the election of 1912 is a convergence of circumstances. Taft feels that the split in the Republican Party has doomed his chances and barely campaigns. Teddy Roosevelt is not able to effectively campaign due to complications of his gunshot wound, and those two things ultimately are somewhat irrelevant in the scheme of the election because splitting the Republican vote in this way makes it very easy for Wilson to win. And that's what we in fact get is there's a landslide. Wilson takes 435 electoral votes, Teddy Roosevelt 88, and Taft a mere 8. And if you look at the election results in detail, had it not been a three-way race, we might have seen a very different outcome. Now, Wilson, once he becomes president, is going to keep close control of the cabinet and delegate authority only to a trusted few, and he's going to build a very strong coalition based on a Democratic majority, but he's also going to bring in progressive Republicans, because for Wilson, progressivism is kind of an important deal. So he's going to lower tariffs, he's going to begin graduated income tax, and again, graduated income tax is old populist demand. He is going to create the Federal Reserve to deal with central banking and monetary policy. Again, that's going back to a certain degree to the populace, is to create the Federal Trade Commission to deal with antitrust issues, a big, important progressive issue. Now, Wilson is ultimately going to back down after Democrats lose big in midterm elections because he feels like he has to get back to his party base, and Wilson is ultimately going to personally oppose certain reforms like suffrage. And he's also going to undo a lot of things that Teddy Roosevelt had done to limit segregation of federal agencies. Now, once the next election comes along and he starts to see Republicans gaining strength and taking back the initiative on the progressive idea, he brings in a second wave of reforms, although mostly in the form of child labor laws, and he appoints a lot of important progressives to the Supreme Court. While the 1912 election was a three-way race, the two losers did go on to do some important things. Teddy Roosevelt is going to actively speak against Wilson, and he's going to help Republicans win those midterm seats that's going to, in fact, caused that panic within the Democratic Party. Teddy Roosevelt is also going to become a big supporter of the Boy Scouts, help that movement take off, although he's going to die very young in 1919 of a heart attack. Now, Taft, on the other hand, is going to leave politics altogether and become a law professor at Yale. He's going to become president of the American Bar Association, and importantly, he's going to become the only U.S. president to also serve as Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. And he's going to do that from 1920 to 1930, and he's going to die about a month after he steps down from the court. And Taft's influence on the Supreme Court and in all the decisions made during that decade are going to have lasting impacts, possibly more so than his presidency itself. So what's the big idea here? Well, first and foremost, progressivism began with the Republican Party, but it spreads to both. But neither party is totally committed to the movement. And for our progressive presidents, how to balance the old guard and the new progressives is something of a problem for them. Now, the big issue for most progressive presidents is what to do with these trusts. For Teddy Roosevelt, it was bust the bad ones. For Wilson, it was bust them all. For Taft, it was let his advisors deal with it. Now, overall, we should understand that Teddy Roosevelt is very active when it comes to reform, and he alienates his party. Taft is neutral, and he alienates his party. Wilson backs down in the face of Democratic losses, but moves forward again to combat Republican gains. And some events are going to take place that are going to move Wilson out of the progressive movement and into some more pressing things on the international scene. And that's really at the end of the progressive movement when it starts to break down. So overall, the three progressive presidents are individuals that really have to balance their party interests in a way that take reform forward. See you in the next lecture.